In the realm of worship, there were a couple of things beginning to change as well. One was the development of the liturgy, that pattern of worship. In the East especially, as we move from the 4th into the 5th century, the spirituality and the practice of the monastics is very influential on the liturgy and what's done in worship. For example, the chanting of psalms. Additionally, by the time of the 4th century into the 5th century, there are those fixed liturgies. Right? This prayer is said at this time. These words are said at this time. In the East, it appears that there was the desire for more specific and exact Christological statements, especially in prayers. Right? So this is, you're going to pray this, so you pray the Orthodox view about Jesus. Now, certainly there were differences between East and West because of region, because of language. So the Western liturgy, worship, prayers, songs were done in Latin. The East encouraged the use of the vernacular. Right? Greek was pretty common, but if you're in Syria, use Syriac. If you're in Egypt, use Coptic, right? Armenian. Right? So there's a development of several different styles of liturgy based on the languages of the people in those regions. At this time, liturgy is much more important in the East. And those Eastern Christians talked about participating in the drama of salvation. And so worship was this very mystical, mysterious event. In the West, more of the focus was on the Eucharist. Right? Everything culminated in the observance of the Eucharist. When we come to church architecture, in the West, basilicas still remain the major structure, right, like we talked about in the 4th century. But in the East, you start to see more vaulted churches centered within a city. One of those prominent and examples of this is the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, now Istanbul. The Church of Holy Wisdom. Hagia Sophia was created by Justinian and has a fairly recognizable structure. Now these towers here are Muslim minarets. So when Muslims took over Constantinople, those were added to Hagia Sophia. So they weren't part of the original structure. One of the things about the Hagia Sophia is you got this center area, and then you got these cascading domes that are very distinct structure. Kind of give you a floor plan of it, right? That center area. When Muslims took over Constantinople, renamed it Istanbul eventually, they built the Blue Mosque. And as you can see, there's a lot of similarity between the two structures. And so they kind of patterned the Blue Mosque after that. The Hagia Sophia today is a museum. It's not really used for church worship because Turkey is a Muslim country. But there's still that kind of cascading dome structure. But it kind of is pretty identifiable even in the night skyline. It was called the Blue Mosque because of the use of blue in the domes and within the mosque as well. And visitors from France called it the color of the Turks, turquoise. So that kind of comes out of that as well. The last thing to talk about with practice in the Middle Ages is I want to talk about the use of images or icons. So we've seen over the past couple centuries the development of Christian art. Right? Starts in the catacombs, makes its way into houses and churches by the 4th century. And there are examples of mosaics. We talked about these very elaborate coffins, statues, gold overlays in churches, and images all became part of Christian practice. But this development isn't without controversy. Ultimately, the monks favored the use of Christian art and images. But there certainly is, right? Where does this come from? Is there a pagan influence here as well? But by the early Middle Ages, especially in the edicts, it became quite common for icons to be in churches. Now, as you might expect, if you just think about it a little bit, you can see how part of the controversy might be over depicting Jesus, right? Having no graven images in the Ten Commandments. If you depict Jesus, is that creating a graven image? Well, there's some parts of that that are part of this. The Third Council of Constantinople, held in the 680 to 681, decided that Christ could only be depicted in human form, where previously he had been depicted also symbolically as a vine, a lamb. We talked about the Good Shepherd, the fish. The fish still remains, but as far as like the emphasis is on, if you're going to depict Jesus, you depict him as a human being. A controversy develops in the East, particularly over icons. Now, an icon was usually an image of the saints, or Mary, or Jesus, usually painted on a piece of wood. There were other forms you might see in mosaics or frescoes or embroidery, but you don't see the use of statues in the East. Right? You don't see that kind of three-dimensional art like we see in the West as statues become gradually important. In the East, the division was between, I'll give you some, I forgot I had some samples of icons. Right? Very stylistic, the Greek letters indicating who it is. Right? This is Jesus, Christ, the C there representing the sigma. Mary, you can kind of make out, looks like this one has not been completely restored, or was destroyed by Muslims as possible as well. And then Joseph being the other one there. Another icon depicting Mary holding the infant child Jesus. Flanking her are Constantine, presenting her a model of Constantinople, and Justinian presenting her a model of the Hagia Sophia. And so suggesting the prominence of Mary and Jesus as well. I can't remember who this one is. I think it might be Peter, but I'm not positive. Other types of icons. So it's not just Jesus and Mary, but others as well. Eventually in the East, there's this division between two groups, the iconoclasts and the iconodules. The iconoclasts did not like the icons, and so they set about trying to destroy them. Ultimately, they're concerned about idolatry. Right? So their concern is more about specifically depictions of Jesus rather than just images in general. But they were also concerned that the use of icons would lead people to honoring certain individuals or the icon itself with too much honor. Right? And so there's kind of, you're misplacing your worship. The iconoclasts weren't totally devoid of art. They had some art, but it was very simplistic and usually not of people. The iconodules, on the other hand, favored the icons. If Jesus was human, why can't we portray him in human likeness? Justinian II favored images so much that favored icons so much that he had images of Christ put on coins. He was later deposed, had his nose cut off, and lived in exile for a time. All right? So not everybody liked the idea of trying to serve God and mammon in the coins. Later emperors, however, didn't share the same view. Now remember, we're talking east here. So Leo III, who was a barbarian but becomes emperor, began to attack images. Now we're getting into the 7th century and the 8th century. So Islam is starting to develop. And so is it because Muslims are getting successful and they're very anti-images of God? Is it the presence of Jews that is also encouraging Leo here? Is it because he had struggles with the monks? Right? The monks had a lot of prominence, and Leo was jealous of that. He garners the support of the army, which was largely iconoclastic. He called for people to get rid of their images. He removes the bishop of Constantinople, ultimately destroys the statue of Jesus and other images. Pope Gregory III condemns his actions. A monk under Muslim rule, a man named John of Damascus, had been an official, but he resigned to become a monk. He's one of the early voices supporting these images. Icons are not idols, he says. They are aids. It's about education, right? That people can connect with an image perhaps better than that. They're commentary. They make those depicted real to people, right? These are people that lived hundreds of years ago. People are not worshiping the image, but what is behind the image. Right? And so he argues the icons represent a spiritual reality. And so that's why they should be allowed. The son of Leo III, who becomes emperor, is Constantine V. He is overthrown by his iconodule brother-in-law. Right, so he's iconoclast. His brother-in-law takes over his empire. He's an iconodule. Constantine later overthrows him, right, and gets back into power. And so he persecutes the iconodules, right, because they had been such a problem. He calls a council, the Council of Hieria. Don't have it on the screen because you don't need to know it. It's a suburb of Constantinople. In that council, all idols were outlawed. It was blasphemous to render God in coal, wood, and stone. But icons continue to be produced. Constantine is succeeded by his son, Leo IV. He's raised iconoclastic. Right? His father was an iconoclast, his grandfather was an iconoclast, but he falls in love with a woman named Irene, who's an iconodule. And so he becomes much more moderate on the issue. Leo dies, but his son, Constantine VI, right? So, right, I named this one Leo, and then you got to name your son Constantine, and you got to name your son Leo, and then you got to name your son Constantine. Right. So, Leo, Constantine. Constantine VI is too young to be in charge, and so Irene becomes empress. And so she reigns in Constantinople. She calls for a council in 787 called Nicaea II, the second one. And they managed to replace that iconoclast army with an iconodule army by manufacturing a barbarian invasion. So they create this spread of a barbarian invasion, swap everybody out for an iconodule army, and then take over the council. The Council of Hieria, which said idols were condemned, that council's condemned. And images are not idols. John of Damascus is praised. He is the great protector of holy images. Eventually, though, Irene is deposed by the army. The emphasis here is on venerating or honoring the icons, not worshiping idols. And so you hear about icon veneration, not worship. In the West, there's just a lot of confusion going on. What is going on over there? Charlemagne, who is the ruler, we'll talk about him in the later Middle Ages, he's in charge in the West, and he misunderstands completely what's going on. He thinks that Nicaea said the icons should be worshipped, which is not what Nicaea said. Nicaea said they're not idols, they should not be worshipped, they should be venerated. And so he becomes iconoclastic as well. Right? And so he stands to try and intervene in all this as well. The issue will flare up again in the middle of the 800s. With Leo V. Eventually, the Emperor Theophilus will persecute iconodules during his reign. He dies, and his wife Theodora ascends to the throne as empress because their son is too young, and she restores the use of icons around the year 842, 843. Finally settling, pretty much, the issue of icons in the Orthodox Church. Orthodox churches, even today, have a feast day, which is known as the Triumph of Orthodoxy, which remembers the reinstallation of icons. What questions do you have? What clarification do I need to? All right, well, we'll finish there today. Don't forget, exam coming up on Tuesday. So if you have any questions, make sure to get in contact with me. Don't forget the essay, the second essay due tomorrow.